I am here with Michael Eamon. He's the principal of Traill College at Trent University. How are you, Michael?
Great, thanks. Good to see
Yes,
you.
yes, it's good seeing you too. I do appreciate you coming on the show since we've known each other for a while. You've been like a great teacher and mentor to me.
Oh, you're very kind. Well, I always enjoy our chats together, so I'm looking forward to today as well.
hmm Yeah, I think this is the first recorded public one, but I would like to start this with a really off the cuff question, and that is, do you think there are too many colors?
Hmm. I don't think there can be ever too many colors, right? That is an off the cuff question. I'm looking around at all my books in my office, and I just love it's kind of like a cacophony of colors. All this different spines and books and things like that. And I know this is audio, but I'm going to show you, the different, and I think, it's kind of they say, well, when you spin the color wheel and all the colors turn white, but I think that's not, perhaps scientifically that's true, but I think what's really wonderful is the great diverse dissonance of all the colors when you see them together in the books. So I can't, I'd be depressed if my library turned Mary Kondo-esque and was all just white covers. I'm glad there are not too many colors. Let me tell you, I'm glad that there's a multicolor hue in my room every day when I walk in.
Yeah, of course. I think it was up to me. I would say I would only pick three.
Oh yeah.
There's yellow, there's light yellow, and there's dark yellow.
Oh,
And I
that's
don't
interesting.
even like yellow.
Hmm. Are you colorblind?
No, I'm not. No, no,
Because it's
I'm just.
funny. It's funny you bring up yellow because my one of my oldest friends was obsessed with the color yellow,
Mhm.
and all of his life, yellow was the color of his birthday cakes and his presents and things like that. And I just learned out 2 years ago that he actually was colorblind, and so
Wow.
that's why yellow was his favorite color because the other ones were just kind of a gray hue, right? And so,
Mhm.
but it took me a little while to figure out why yellow was so important. So, anyways, I was just wondering, but you yellow for you, that it's just, is there something special about yellow and all of its hues, or?
It's my least favorite color.
Oh, okay.
And like I said, it was up to me. Everything would be yellow, light yellow, or dark yellow.
Oh wow. Okay. Well, that's a little depressing, but clearly, it's sad that it's your least favorite color. I won't introduce you to my friend then because I'm not quite sure. You might clash.
But yeah, it's a funny thing because I believe that people stop asking me what my favorite color is when I reach the age of 10. And I kind of miss that. I kind of miss being asked what's your favorite color is when as you grow older. Like it's kind of like a date question or in some sense a deal breaker.
Yeah, well, fair enough. I get that. It's I'm a bit older than you, so I have kids, and so the I get asked quite frequently what my favorite color is for my kids, or "Oh, that is, you don't want that cup because it's not your favorite color. So don't worry, hang in there. People will start asking you again a lot about your favorite color at some point.
No, that's good. Yeah, so this brings us to what you are an expert as at history. And I participated in a class of yours called History and Film, which,
Mhm.
for the record, it is up there in one of the class where I had to spend the most amount of time with. And it's called Film and History, so there are a lot of movies around. And I wonder, is it preferable to make historical movies in color or in black and white?
That's interesting. Well, I'm glad, and I enjoyed having you in that class because you're such a film aficionado. I don't know if your audience realizes how much you know about film, classic and otherwise. And so it was great to have such, someone who really has a passion for film in that class.
Thank you very
Black and
much.
white of color, that's interesting. Well, in the class we talked about how there's something called the collective memory and also both the historical imagination. And collective memory is this idea of there are events, you didn't even have to experience them yourselves, but events that everybody knows about or touchstones. And then historical imagination is very related to that. It's the idea that everybody has a sense of what the past should be like, may not be what the past was like, but
Hmm
what the past should be like. And this idea of color versus black and white is interesting because I think some people feel that the past, because of black and white photography, that is what past memories are somehow turned from color to sepia to black and white, and then black and white is where the past lives. And
hmm
you can even see that in movies such as Schindler's List or that, where it starts in color but then fades quickly. into black and white. I don't think they have to be one or the other, but I do feel that filmmakers playing to the historical imagination sometimes, can use that to their benefit, right? The movie Pearl Harbor, the Jerry Bruckheimer one that we
Yeah.
had, there was black and white segments of that where they started, it was in color, but then when they really wanted to feel like they were being historical, they would have black and white segments of home movies and things like that. I think a good cinematographer and a good director, uses color. It's interesting how you brought up color as the beginning segue of this class. I don't know if it was that random a question. I don't think you have random questions, Jiang, but I think going back to that whole sense of color and depth and things like that. I think a good cinematographer or director will use every tool in the toolkit to kind of evoke emotions, and I think it depends on what they're trying to do. And black and white in many people's minds in the collective is that idea of truly what the past, and that connection to the past, it kind of breaks, because when you're in color, you're in them here and now, and so to kind of complete that break and that transfer from the world we today to the world we have lost type of thing, I think black and white can be used. But back to your initial question, I don't think one or the other is more beneficial. I do feel that using different colors and tones and that, and black and white is also is again a good tool to help suspend disbelief when you're talking about the past, if that makes sense.
Of course, yes. And I'm reminded of the Paul Schrader film Mishima, Life in Four Chapters, which
I have not
is
seen
a
that one, but tell me all about it.
oh right, it's a brilliant film. It is about the life and the work of Japanese playwright and novelist Yukio Mishima, and the film is both in black and white and in color, and in certain segment really really bright colors.
Right.
So the color section, the regular color section, is focuses on the last day of his life as he's about to commit seppuku, and it goes back to his past, which is depicted in black and white as he grows to develop this code of honor, and his disillusion with Japan after the war. So he has this weird nostalgia for like Imperial Japan, which it's rather troubling. But some of the aspects or some of the scenes of his works are depicted in really bright colors, which shows like his fascination with, again, death. He finds death to be the most transient thing of all, and and characters die a lot in his plays and his novels, and it's all being portrayed as probably the greatest thing that's ever happened to them. So it's an incredibly compelling movie, and this is what I think coming out of that the history and film class you taught that. Although, I mean, the point of cinema is to tell a story, is to create a narrative. And I think no matter how compelling the narrative is, it is difficult to use that as a reliable source for, historical facts and such. So this is what is different about like historical facts and fiction, and even documentaries fictionalize things sometimes, or at least omit certain events to fit a story.
Yeah, no, well, you bring up a couple great points, many great points, and one is, one of the major commonalities between film, historical or non-historical, and the historical craft is narrative, right? Narrative and the idea for humans to engage in narrative, to tell narrative, to have animated narrative, and this goes back to cave drawings 30,000 years ago in France, right on the walls. People wanted to not only have narratives, but have animated or depicted elements to correspond with that narrative, and that goes all the way up then to through theater and then movies, and now digital productions and things. We do this idea of narrative, and kind of an animated narrative is very inherent to the human kind of enjoyment and existence. But also in history in particular, history is all about selection. And that also talks a lot to kind of the idea of narrative through film, because film uses all sorts of different cuts and juxtapositions and things, often to fit that 2-hour window frame, right? And it's not all about historical facts, because you have to cut and make some liberties to get there. And a historian who is writing a textual thing also has to make selections too. And although they have the kind of the luxury of being able to be able to present their research in a more holistic fashion, that doesn't necessarily say that film and kind of textual history are in opposition to each other. In fact, I think they're have more in common than some people would want to admit. And in fact, I feel that film in particular really captures the emotion of the past, more so than perhaps a textual work can in some ways, and that I don't think you want to discount that. I think the idea of being able to bring someone to cry, or to have someone really feel like they've gotten into the mind of someone 500 years ago, or 300 years ago, or 40 years ago, I think that is very powerful, and that's something that film can do through it, in spite of the issues of selection and narrative that may differ.
Mhm. Which I think brings me to the I guess my critique, I guess, of history itself, or at least the historical, the process of recording history. In that, for the most part, it is really just educated speculation. Like there's no real observation in history, because time flows in one direction. So you rely on these competing accounts of, say, a person or an event, and it is, it is your job to determine what is true. And I'm guessing you know the process more than I am. I think about this example of the American baseball player Ty Cobb.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And for, I think there was a book by this guy Al Stump, which is supposedly a biography of Cobb, but it portrays him in an incredibly negative light, and it highlights his alleged racism. And it was made into a movie starring Tommy Lee Jones, but after a while, the Al Stump's book is proven to be bunk, and the racist allegations are later to be found unfounded. So yeah.
No, I hear what you're saying. There's a lot of what really fascinates me is the philosophy and the methodology of history, and historiography is the study of the writing of history. And there's also philosophy of history too, where people look at kind of the historical craft and what are historians actually trying to do, right? And a lot has been written about kind of bias, how to check bias, about facts, about truth, what is truth, all these things. And some people, even people like Leopold von Ranke, 200 years ago, considered kind of the father of modern history, saw history kind of as more scientific, and that facts could actually be proven true. And if you could prove a fact true, you can actually figure out what actually happened in the past. And there's been a lot of debate over what can we actually tell what happened in the past. And the reality of the situation is no. A historian is a professional who hopefully understands all the foibles and fallibility of the past, but still in the end has to say there are still lessons and important knowledge that can be gained through the recount or the retelling of a past story. And we know that selection's involved, and we know that interpretation is involved. So you can have somebody say, oh, this person was X or Y, and then the next generation will say, well, actually he wasn't, if you review this. And all history, even academic history, really is a product of the time in which it's created. And that's why historiography is an interesting study, because you look at history, who was written by, when it was written by, and what values of that era are actually reflected in the history itself. And if you remember in our history of film class, that was also part of it. The historical films were important, but what values from the later 80s, early 90s did Steven Spielberg reflect in Schindler's List? What crazy values did Jerry Bruckheimer reflect at the turn of the millennium in Pearl Harbor and Return of Martin Guerre and other? We talked about a lot of movies that talked about a lot of different time periods. But in fact, we had that kind of meta narrative too about how, what about the time period in which the film was shot, written, and created, and the audience that it was trying to get. And so any work is also trying to tap in to the audience of the time, and that also brings a whole set of inherent limitations and also kind of opportunities.
Right. I think an example I can think of to, I guess, further expand your point a bit is the rise of Western movies around the time of early Hollywood.
Mm-hmm.
And after a while, there's a genre called the post-Western or anti-Western, which, of course, portrayed the same lens setting, but in a more, I guess, reflective or morose or melancholic way. I'm thinking of films like The Searcher or Unforgiven,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and I believe the change in tone do reflect the time period in which those Western movies were made, because I think the post-Western films were released when America has a better conception of race relations. Would you say that to be true?
Yeah, no, definitely. You can definitely, and you PhDs have been written on this, even small, books. That I totally agree. You can totally look at something like the genre of the Western and looks at, the public will only accept what the public accepts. And so in some ways, stories like The Searcher, Searchers may not have been able to be produced in the 1930s or 20s because the public wasn't ready for that level of narrative. Some people were, but the general, more popular public wasn't. Or you can take any movie or genre that and say certain things. Clockwork Orange could not have been produced as a movie any other time than when it was produced because it just kind of came together and hit the zeitgeist of the era, right? So I think you're very right, and I think it's very important. Historians we're really good with textual analysis and saying, okay, well, this was written by a historian, they have biases. This was written 30 years ago by a historian, so that historian is imbibing the ideas of 30 years ago. We're not as good sometimes in seeing that in media, and particularly movies. And as you say, you're right. If you look hard enough, you can see that the spaghetti Western, kind of the counter to that of the 70s or late 60s, early 70s, is also kind of reflecting a kind of moment in time. And you look at sometimes Mel Brooks movies that are quite sharp. Blazing Saddles, for example. I don't think that movie could be produced today or even later. It was produced as its existence is very fascinating because and popularity, and that in itself. And this is not new. People in cultural studies and film studies dive into this. But what I find interesting is I look at particularly how historical films are portrayed, and as I said, there's that other level that this is happening. This idea of audience and reflection of contemporary values, but it's also being reflected in a historical thing. And that is something we always have to be aware of. I always say public history is the use and abuses of the past and the present. And we often will fill in the gaps in our historical analysis with, when I say we, the general public, will fill in the gaps in our understanding of the past with contemporary touchstones or issues. And that in itself can color the way you look at the past.
Um, one of the questions that I would like to have your take on is why study history? I think I have my own way of answering it, and it comes from the two quotations. One is, I believe, it's attributed to Hegel, and he says history repeats itself. And another one is attributed to Marx, and he added it with um, the first time is a tragedy, the second is a farce. And I think the reason why we would study history is because what we are doing right now, in terms of public events, is something that perhaps has been done in one version or another in a previous time, or in a previous in another regime or state. Yeah, so I think.
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying. Yeah, and the idea of the cyclical nature of history. A lot of philosophers that you've mentioned, some talk about it. George Santayana famously coined the phrase, those who don't study their history are doomed to repeat it. That this idea that there's some sort of value in history in its study, some lessons that can be learned, and that there's a cyclical nature to history. Humanity has cyclical patterns for sure. You know, I think
Hmm.
people do tend to kind of fall down similar things, but history itself doesn't repeat it. You will never have the same event happen twice. You'll have similar circumstances, perhaps similar causalities, but things are never going to repeat themselves perfectly. And that's, you know, I think you've hinted at this before, you know, history, I don't think history is scientific, because good science, you need to be able to have, be able to repeat the results that you get, and observe that repetition, and you can't necessarily do that in history. But I do think, why study history? Well, I think everything has a history. So I think if you are an expert at anything, the history of film, if you're a film buff, if you're an art buff, whatever you are, you should also know the history of that subject, and why we are where we are there. And you know, and I do think that there are lessons to be learned from the past. I don't think, and I think that that is kind of a key element for me. I feel that history often is taught poorly in elementary and secondary schools, and this is nothing against elementary or secondary school teachers. I feel that often history, though, is taught with to evaluate it, and to evaluate the masses. It's like, do you know the answer? Do you not? When was Confederation? When did this happen? When did this person die? What will happen? You know, name the 5 elements of this. You know, they're easy to mark. And that's not, for me, that's not history. That is repeating rote learning, or kind of knowing kind of general facts about something. History for me is a process of understanding. And I think that's really the value of history, is that it gives us a sense of context in the past, and it gives us a sense of understanding of that past, and perhaps a little bit more understanding for the present, right? And I feel we're in a time where understanding is perhaps lacking a little, and I feel that the greatest value of the past is to promote that sense of understanding, not to forgive things in the past, but to understand why they occurred, and to perhaps understand why things are continuing to occur, or it appears like they're repeating today. And I think that is the greatest lesson. And back to the evaluation of history, that's really tough to evaluate understanding, right? And I think that's why a lot of people get turned off of history at a young age, is because they're only getting marked, or they're only learning history for the evaluative part of it. You know, the idea of, do you know this or do you not? They're not getting necessarily marked on, how is your greater understanding improved, and write me an essay about that, right? You know, some good high school history teachers get there, but it's hard when your only mandatory credit in this province is in grade 9. You know, you never can get there, right? And so all that to say, I think history has a value. I feel that I think we fail students sometimes from the earliest age, because we're not teaching it in a kind of comprehensive enough way for them to get the full value of it, if that makes sense.
Hmm. Yes. I think an issue I have with, I guess, the how we teach history, and of course this is one of the problems I have with studying history in my own country, Vietnam as well, is they tend to focus a lot on figures, characters. You know, like for example, it's like who was George Washington, and everybody knows who George Washington is, but it's hard to find people who have the grasp of why the American Revolution happened. Or most people know who Adolf Hitler is and rightly condemn him, but people do not know that the circumstances are ripe for a Hitler-esque figure to be. And if it wasn't him, it could be someone else who has similar ideas. And yeah.
Yeah, no, yeah, I see where you're going. It's yeah, it's how do I want to approach this? It is. I find it tough with there's something called hagiography, and hagiography is the study of the saints, and that doesn't make good history. Like, if you put someone up on a pedestal and you make them a saint, you're doing something with their history that they don't necessarily want themselves, especially if they're dead. They have no say in it.
Mhm.
If you listen to the musical Alexander Hamilton, there's actually a lot of kind of good nuggets about historical analysis in that. And one of
Mhm.
them is the song, the line, "Who lives, who dies, who tells your story?" You don't actually have any say over that. And I think this is the challenge that we have, is when we create heroes, all history is about selection. And so how do we tell that story in a succinct way? Well, then you focus on one person and their deeds, and then those deeds kind of transcend that one person and their deeds and become symbolic of a whole value system, or things that may not actually be, things that also the person may not have believed in, but also gloss over their actual true things. People are very complicated, and to turn people into a pastiche of values, like George Washington, well, he clearly symbolized X, Y, and Z. Well, maybe he didn't clearly symbolize that. Maybe he X and Y, but he didn't believe in Z, but he still existed. And you see this today with the movement to kind of remove statues, and rightly so in some cases. But many of the statues that are put up, often the individual had no say in it, and then the statue then becomes a symbol, right? It becomes a symbol of a whole movement or an era, some of which that person was a part of, but perhaps that person didn't even know what was, what was going to come of that era, and then becomes an icon that iconoclasts need to tear down. And as I said, in some ways, rightly so. But the challenge is that we should never make saints out of the people of the past. We should understand them for both the good and bad, and see how they were of their time, and perhaps maybe pushing the elements of their time too. But I feel that that's where some of the danger is now, is that we kind of oversimplify people's contributions. And as I say, some of these people, they would agree. They'd look back and say, "My God, that wasn't me. Why would you even say I did that?" Right? Or they might even go push and is like, "Yeah, you think that? Well, I actually thought even this." And go, "What do you think about that?" So it is interesting, and I think this is part of the professional historian's job. That's why some people find academic history, quote unquote, boring, is because it's about subtleties and nuance. And it was interesting. I was listening to a podcast, where it's all podcasts these days, with Conan O'Brien and oh my goodness, what's the name of the British comic who was in Night in the Museum and different things? He'll come back to me in a second.
Ricky Gervais, yeah.
Not Ricky Gervais, but he's a friend for Ricky Gervais.
Yeah.
He'll come to me in a second. Anyways, he was talking about Steve Coogan.
Oh, right.
Conan O'Brien was talking with Steve Coogan, and Steve Coogan says, the world and the past is really about nuance. Nuance is important, and today nuance is more important than ever. But he says you don't see people driving around with bumper stickers that say "I love nuance." It's true, right? People kind of want a digested and often extreme version of what's going on. They don't necessarily believe in kind of weighing and looking at all the different pieces, and that's what a professional historian tries to do, but unfortunately gets kind of painted with the badge of that's kind of boring. Nuance can be boring.
I would like to pivot to another perhaps more lighthearted topic, and perhaps historical too, and that is how you've come to be who you are, a professor of history and the principal of Traill College. And I would like to perhaps get a glimpse of your years as an undergraduate when you are my age.
Oh.
And a bonus question would be, do you think your music taste changed from that point in time compared to now?
Yes. Well, yeah, yes, and yes. Let me start with the undergrad thing, and then talk a little bit about music for sure. Yeah, how have I changed? I think fundamentally we are who we always are. I think we learn to kind of deal with some of the issues like anxiety. I was full of anxiety. I didn't know what I was going to do with my life. I knew I wanted to be history. In my high school yearbook, I said that I would be a history professor, which it was a weird thing for me to way back then to see. But in another way, I had this profound love of the past. And again, not for the facts and figures. Even early on in high school, what I loved about the past, where it's the narratives, the stories, but also this idea of wanting to know more and understanding who I am and what society is about. All those things were very important to me back as an undergraduate. And I studied at the University of Ottawa on purpose. I'd gotten into other universities, Queen's and Western and that. But I studied at the University of Ottawa on purpose. One, because I wanted to improve my French language skills, which were really bad at the time. And two, I believed thoroughly in Canada and the importance of trying to make a better country. And I felt if I was based in the capital, I'd be kind of near the gears of Parliament, but also have the resources to the National Library, the National Archives. It was weird that as an undergraduate, that's what I was thinking about, is I want to be closer to the National Archives and things. But that's what drew me to Ottawa. And as my life progressed, I learned so much more, of course, as anyone does in an undergrad, more than just about history, but about social behavior and people and interaction. But that's where I kind of as an undergraduate, how I felt. And I was, like everybody, anxiety. I was anxious to go to class, anxious to make a comment. Often you get shot down in seminar, or the professors, you'd make this great point, and the professor's like, yeah, that doesn't really make sense. And, but you learn, right? And you kind of build upon that. And I was also, University of Ottawa was founded originally by the Oblate Fathers in the 1840s. And so it had a liberal Roman Catholic kind of bent, even when I went there. And so, philosophy, a history of history, all these things were mandatory courses that you had to take. And sometimes you think, oh, you want to give people tons of choice, but sometimes you learn the most when you're forced to take something and forced to read it, and then you realize, no, I really introduced something new. It's hard to pick the menu items when you've never eaten any of them, right? But if you're forced to eat them and dissect them and enjoy them, then that opens your mind sometimes. And because it had such a strong kind of traditional liberal arts curriculum, it really introduced me to things like philosophy and history in ways that I think I benefited from all my life. Back to music. I started singing when I was 5 years old as an Anglican chorister, and then played piano and became a percussionist in my early years. And so most of my musical influences until high school was all classical music. I listened to classical music, choral music, but also, classical music. And when I say classical, I mean it in the generic term, meaning everything from Renaissance to classical to romantic to all that. Then as I started hitting university, then I started getting more into rock and roll and jazz and funk and things like that, and even heavy metal. So my first couple of years of university, I really started listening to Black Sabbath and sounds that I'd never ever thought of, and even had kind of some sort of biases against, like, those I don't want to be a metalhead. I don't want to listen to I don't want to listen to Sabbath or anything like that. And I really enjoy it. So now how did my listening taste turn? As I said, I became more mainstream in my listening in university, but also heavier in the kind of the rock and roll type of thing. I was my favorite band, I told you I was all into classical music and things like that, with the exception of one big prog rock band, the Alan Parsons Project. I got hooked on the Alan Parsons Project in grade 8, and for high school and I have all their deep cuts and EPs and things like that, because I really enjoyed that. And I think, I'm going all along here, but the big thing is, if you like the Alan Parsons Project, the big thing about Alan Parsons, he doesn't consider himself a singer so much as he's an engineer. He helped record Dark Side of the Moon. Like, he loves sound. He loves how sound comes together. And for me, that's what I loved. I love this idea of rock and roll and the kind of beat of rock and roll, but also kind of layering of sounds, and somebody who had an ear for not just choral music or the choralness of music, the melody of music, but how music layered. And so that really still to this day influenced me musically. And that's why I didn't have room in my life for what I thought was kind of noise, which I thought was metal. But now I listen to I have room for all that. Even Nickelback I have room for in my life.
Oh, wow. Do you still listen to metal music in your life? It's hard to imagine someone of, I guess, your age. I've never asked you your age, but I would presume is at least 5 years older than me.
Yes, at least 5, yeah.
Yeah, but it's so I'm guessing you still listen to metal music.
Yeah, I do. I've never been into the whole Swedish death metal heavy. I've listened to that. I've never Guar, things like that. I've never really got deep into that, but I still listen to Sabbath from the and Ozzy Osbourne and things like that. All that, again, it's Kiss, glam rock, that kind of, like, now I'm moving from metal to kind of glam rock type of thing. But Kiss I enjoy. Bon Jovi, now even getting more kind of this idea of processed, so move from processed rock too. I think that's why I like Nickelback so much. It's so overproduced. It is actually kind of fun to listen to and think, oh my god, but wow, the production value is super high. But that is my secret pleasure, is that but when I want to get away from that, then I kind of go back to Def Leppard and then even deeper to Ozzy and things like that. And there's a lot of great stories to those songs too that are important.
Yeah, it's funny. I believe my first and only Nickelback song that I've listened to is this one called "Saving Me" from their 2005 album "All the Right Reasons." And is I first listened to it when I was 10, and I believe uh, that is where I think that's when I first become what you would call a teenager, like the kind of being very adopt this very juvenile cynicism about life and death and everything. Because the music video of "Saving Me" by Nickelback, which I still listen to this day, is a pretty nice song. It features this guy who is endowed with a power to see how much time everyone on Earth has left. Like uh, on top of people's head, there's this like clock that ticks away at everyone's life, and once it goes to zero, then that person dies. And um, so he knows of that, and so he saves a life. But upon saving that life, he loses the power, and the person whose life he saved gains that power. So, I
Yeah,
mean, it's
and that's all wrapped up in a song, right? And it's
yes,
yeah, it's yeah, it's and that's yeah, that's what shocks you, because sometimes you think all these. I always find those songs, the ones that sound kind of fun and are
mhm,
poppy, and then you actually listen to the lyrics and you're like, oh my god, that's what that's really about.
mhm,
I find that that, and that in some ways, what I find really fascinating about music is it has so many levels, right? There's the musicality of it, there's the lyrics, there's how the lyrics and the music kind of interact, and then there's what the lyrics actually say. And I think some of the most fascinating songs are when there's that kind of dissonance between the what the lyrics, the story, and sometimes the feeling that the music gives you.
mhm. What would be an example for you, like of that kind of song that contains dissonance?
Oh, there's all sorts of ones. What is that one that oh, it was done as a bet? What is what, I'm trying to remember. Oh my goodness. It was huge. It was it'll come back to me. Okay, I'll have to think about it for a second. But there's one of those songs that I think was done. No, was it Glenn Campbell who did it? Then let me just. I'm just going to Google here, and my memory's bad these days. MacArthur Park.
Mhm,
I think that was done. The rumors. I think it was done as a bet with Glenn Campbell, and that's one where the lyrics are absolutely nuts and don't make any sense all about cakes out in the rain and things like
mhm,
that. But the musicality, if you haven't listened to MacArthur Park, is a great kind of rock anthem type of song with all just so much going on there. But again, the lyrics, there's a total dissonance. Like it makes no sense whatsoever. The lyrics.
mhm. Right. I another song that I think of is the one that my dad actually really likes. It's "Hotel California" by
Mm-hmm.
Eagles. It's one of those songs where I first started to ponder the lyrics. Actually, of course,
Yeah.
you know that the song is very much allegorical, and it can be an allegory of many things. But I think the most impressive line for me is that is it "Relax at the night, man. We are programmed to receive. You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave." And I thought it's incredibly poetic, and I think it was around the same time when I followed that Nickelback instinct of being so cynical about life and death. It it impacted me in ways that I could not uh, could not describe at that time. You know.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. There's so much, and it happens on so many levels. I think something. I agree with the Hotel California. It's one where you kind of listen to the radio and you tap your toes, and then you listen to the lyrics and like, oh, there's something here going on that's a bit deeper. Now this song, what's his name? Rupert. What the heck is his name? Rupert Holmes. He's the guy that did the Pina Colada song, right? Escape. That's another one where if you actually, I think I've sang it, with friends at parties and things like that for decades until you actually listen to the lyrics and you're like, oh my gosh, that's a little bit more warped than I thought this song was going to be about. And so there are tons of songs like that where are huge chart toppers too. And then you kind of listen a little bit to the lyrics and you think, there's something more going here. And I wonder what that says about our psyche. I'm sure people have written about this elsewhere, but that we kind of let the tune take us away and are not so fussed about the lyrics. And I know this is huge in folk songs, right? Like the songs like The Girl Who Left Behind Me and things like that. The traditional folk songs, the tune gets recycled over and over and over again, and people just keep adding new lyrics to it. So there's something about kind of how we talk about dissonances, but it's how the tune really propels the song, and the tune can be kind of ancient, but the lyrics keep changing and sometimes don't have anything to do with the tune, but people still will accept that, right? Which is interesting, I find.
Wow. Yes. Yes. So we are down to final minutes here, and
Okay.
well, we've touched on the past and the present, but I would like to ask you a question regarding the future. Have you ever wondered, like maybe a century from now, or even the next century, even what will be the most notable events being recorded in this one,
Mm.
or what will people in the next century think of the previous one? Kind of
Yeah,
like
no,
that.
it's a tough one because as a historian, historians there are archivists. There's all sorts of professions that are involved in memory and preservation. And archivists from time to time go to historians and say, historians, what kind of records will you be searching in the future? And not always do archivists consult historians, but they sometimes do, and they did that so in the 50s. And some are actually doing the problem with digital records. People are doing that with consulting historians again. And I think, sometimes the best person and the worst person to ask about what the future will hold is a historian, because a historian's so focused on kind of looking backwards to those record sets, not necessarily projecting forward. I feel we are in a crisis right now of documentation. So the history is only as good as the documents that exist for the historian to do an analysis of. And the challenge now with digital records is that we are not building in longevity or preservation of those records as they're being created. So paper, for example, the very structure of paper makes it that those documents will last at least 500 years, if not longer, if kept nicely, right? And you can kind of forget about them. Other things like black and white film, we know that its basic inherent structure is stable and can keep the images for a certain amount of time. Digital records are totally unstable. And the digital products that we create with those digital records, websites, blogs, audio files, YouTube videos, even this podcast, the idea of that we have not really thought about how to preserve and maintain these records for a long period of time. And one example is the Desert Storm, 1989, 1990, when the Americans invaded Iraq. That was the first conflict that the Americans used entirely digital photography in to document the conflict. And by the year 2000, almost half of that digital photography had been corrupted. The digital files were not preserved. So they lost half of their digital record in just 10 years. And so I know this is a long answer to your question, but the thing is, what will historians be talking about in 100 years' time? Probably about a generation or two of people who really didn't care about keeping their records in a systematic way, right? A systematic way. And that, we could know probably more about the early 21st century, but unfortunately they just weren't concerned about the record keeping. They were more concerned about producing tweets and Instagram posts and things like that than actually keeping them. And so that might be, what kind of society they judge us by, that we were very consumer oriented, media savvy, consumer oriented, but not caring about longevity. And that'd be interesting to see if that is the issue, and what records will be kept. Now, of course, records burn. Things, we don't have a full set of records from any era of any time in humanity. But I wonder, and the mere fact that a bazillion things are being produced digitally and then repeated and copied and copied and copied and copied and copied, that will ensure some longevity to the record. But I feel historians in 100 years' time will look at this era and go, it was an era of great technological change. It was an era where democracy and access to publishing video and sound was huge, and people took advantage of that. But it was also an era where perhaps people weren't so concerned about where that record would go And so I wish I could be around in 100 years to see what historians will say.
Mhm. Just an aside, I mean, it's really worth pondering, but just an aside, they are going to construct a presidential library for the previous president of the United States, Donald Trump, and it is very much possible that one of the things they would feature is his entire Twitter archive.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be like the highlight. So his petty insults to like celebrities like Rosie O'Donnell will be part of the presidential library.
Yeah, well, which is interesting. So, presidential libraries it's a bit of a misnomer because it's all run by the National Archives in the United States. But every president gets a library. And there was some concern because when Trump actually had his Twitter account taken down, some people were like, this is, how will we know about Trump in the future and things like that? And it's like, well, I think we'll know. But it does bring up an interesting thing too about this corporate world we live in, where our main platforms of communication are privately owned. And so how presidential libraries normally work is if he had followed normal protocols, there would be government copies of his messages and things like that, and they would go to the library. But since one of his predominant organs of communication was a corporate platform, it kind of also makes things concerned. Now, the onus would then be on Twitter at some point to then transfer all those files to the National Archives or to the Presidential Library. And I think that is what's going to happen, is that those master files will be transferred over. But it is, that is another issue about preservation and communication, is that as we believe it's democratized because we have, more voices are being held, but those voices are being broadcast again through similar kind of limited corporate channels. And I think those corporations are going to have to kind of get on board and make sure that those records are available for the future. And I think someone like Trump, of course, because he's the president, even the tweets will be available. But your tweets, my tweets, I don't know if Twitter will care enough to forward those to the archives.
Yeah, well, I think that's one of the reasons why I don't use Twitter. But so we've reached our final question, and it is, what advice do you have for people who are undergraduates, Trent, right now, not just in history, but of all, majors, and especially ones who are graduating
Yeah,
this year?
it's a tough time, and particularly, of course, with the ever-present, specter of COVID and things like that. I think a lot of people are perhaps disheartened, maybe a little depressed about what the future has. And the one, being a historian and having lived it myself, every undergraduate upon graduation feels a bit depressed because you've had your life locked down to a course of action for at least 4 years, 3 to 4 years, if not more, and now you're going to figure out what's the next step. And so I think what's important to know is that there are next steps, and it's important to know that you cannot always see what those next steps are going to be. And I think that's the hardest thing, because it's perspective, context, understanding is something that is gained by the historian by looking backwards. And when you're in a moment, or if you don't have a long durée to look backwards at, it can be very anxiety ridden and stress filled. And I think my advice was to people is take a deep breath and it will happen. The Trent degree that you've got is particularly good at building resilience into students, right? And resilience is as important as what you know as how you can deal with the unknown and things. So I think my biggest advice is hang in there, things will happen. 8 years ago, I did not know that I'd become a principal at Trent University. I've been principal of Lady Eamon College and of Traill College. I did not know that. I did not know I'd be acting director of Trent International. I did not know I'd be director of continuing education. There's a whole bunch of things that I am now or have been that I had no clue 8 years ago that would happen. And they've all been great. And reflecting back, you can say, wow, that was good. It all worked out. But I don't know where I'm going in the future. And I think that is part of the excitement of graduating, but also part of the anxiety is like, what will the future have? So reflect upon what you've done, be proud about what you've done, know that your degree does mean something, and it's not only just knowledge of subject, but also resilience and knowledge of kind of ability that you've gained. But most importantly, realize there's more to come. Just don't force it. It will present itself. And I think patience is hard, but if you can be patient, things will present themselves. And then in 10 years, you will be reflecting back saying, wow, I didn't believe I could do that, but I did.
With that being said, thank you very much for appearing on the program, Michael. It's been a
Uh,
pleasure and an honor.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to chat with you, and all the best, Joe.
Take care.
Bye.